Lanterns swung on thin wires inside the town barn, and in a place like Cold Water, that light wasn't just for seeing, it was for judging. Every soul in the valley was packed inside, their voices loud, their forgiveness thin. It was harvest supper night, the one evening a year where you could laugh too loud and not have it held against you come Sunday. But for Evelyn Ward, silence was the only thing she prayed for. She moved through the crowd like a ghost, a basket of bread rolls held against her chest like a shield. The dress she wore was borrowed, smelling of someone else's life, of soap and wood smoke. Her shoulders were tight, her eyes were down. She was trying to be invisible. Across the room, her sister Margaret was the opposite of invisible. She shone brighter than any lantern, with her lace sleeves and painted lips, and that cruel little smile she saved just for family. And tonight, Margaret was feeling generous with her cruelty. She waited until the fiddler took a breath, waited until the whole barn was listening. "Don't drop anything this time, Evie," she sang out, her voice dripping with false sweetness. Laughter answered her, sharp and quick. Men on the benches grinned. Even the pastor's wife, a woman who preached mercy every Sunday, hid a smirk behind her cup. The shame was a physical thing, a heat that crawled up Evelyn's neck. Then Margaret turned her attention to the doorway, where a tall rancher had just stepped in, shaking the rain from his hat. A man who kept to himself, a man named Samuel Redden. "Why, Samuel?" Margaret called, her voice now a playful purr. "Are you looking for a serving girl? Perhaps Evie can fetch your plate. She's free." The words didn't just land, they exploded. Evelyn froze, the basket trembling in her hands. The eyes of the entire town burned into her, and in that hot, terrible silence, a single bread roll tumbled from the basket and landed in the sawdust. Someone snickered. It was the sound of a nail being hammered into a coffin. Before she could even think to bend down, to hide her face and retrieve the roll, a shadow fell over her. Samuel Redden had crossed the barn in 3 long strides. He didn't look at Margaret. He didn't look at the laughing faces. He looked at the floor. He stooped, his tall frame folding easily, and lifted the bread from the dirt. With a gloved hand, he brushed the sawdust off, careful as if it were something precious. Then he set it gently back in her basket. "Guess supper's better when a man earns it," he said. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the noise like a razor, shaming the thunder outside. The barn fell completely still. You could hear the lantern chains clicking in the draft. The fiddler's bow hung in mid-air, a silent question. And Margaret's perfect painted smile cracked like thin ice on a winter pond. Samuel Redden straightened up, his eyes sweeping the room just once. He didn't need to say a word. The challenge was clear in his gaze. He dared anyone to laugh again. Nobody did. A dog barked somewhere out in the rain, the sound echoing through the loft, a signal that the night, and maybe everything else, had just turned. Evelyn felt a knot in her throat so tight she couldn't breathe. Gratitude was fighting with humiliation, and both were losing. She turned and fled toward the doors, the crowd parting for her like water, their silence now a different kind of judgment. The cold night air hit her face, sharp with the smell of rain. Behind her, the fiddler made a clumsy attempt to start a tune, but the joy had been bled from the room. The rhythm was broken. As Evelyn reached the threshold, a gust of wind tore through the open doorway. It snatched the ribbon from her hair, a small strip of pale blue satin. It was a ribbon her sister had worn just that morning, before tossing it aside as if it were trash. The ribbon fluttered across the sawdust floor, dancing in the lantern light, before coming to a stop right beside Samuel Redden's boots. He looked down at it, and for just a second the hard line of his jaw softened. He looked at that scrap of blue fabric as if it were a memory, something sacred he thought he'd lost forever. Margaret saw him look. She saw the change in his face, and she went perfectly still. Her pride twisted into something much darker, something venomous. Evelyn didn't see any of it. She was already outside, the rain plastering her thin dress to her skin. She leaned against the wet fence rail, trembling, watching the golden light from the barn windows blur and bleed into the drizzle. "Just one night without shame," she whispered to the storm. But the wind was cruel. It caught her words and seemed to throw them back through the barn doors, right to where the little blue ribbon waited, glinting like a promise that had just been broken between two strangers. Inside, Samuel bent down. He picked up the ribbon, folded it once, carefully, and slipped it deep into his coat pocket. Then he followed the sound of the rain out into the dark, not knowing he was walking straight into the first page of a story that would change both their lives forever. The rain hammered the tin roof of the barn long after the music died, and the last wagon rattled away. It was a noise that drowned out gossip, but it couldn't drown out regret. Samuel Redden stood alone near the empty tables, his hat in his hands, watching the last of the lamplight tremble on the puddles outside. He was not a man built for company. Silence had been his only neighbor for years, ever since the fever came and took his wife, Mary. It left him with 1,000 acres of work and not a single reason to sing. But tonight, the silence felt different. It was heavier, filled with the words he hadn't said, the anger he hadn't shown when Margaret Ward used her sister's heart for sport. He could still see Evelyn's face, the way she flinched, and he could still feel the impossible weight of that little blue ribbon in his pocket. It felt like holding a ghost. The men had all gone home to their wives, the women to their beds to dream up new stories, and only the storm was left to keep him company. He walked to the massive doorway and looked out into the dark, where the rain was turning the world to mud and shadow. And then he saw her. She was still there, Evelyn, standing by the corral fence, soaked through to the bone. She was clutching her thin shawl with both hands, as if it was the only thing holding her together, the only thing keeping her dignity from washing away in the flood. For a long moment he just watched her. He let the quiet stretch between them, a fragile bridge over the noisy night. Then he walked out, his boots sinking into the mud, each step a decision. "You'll catch your death," he said, his voice rough from disuse. She startled, spinning around. Her eyes were wide in the darkness, a mix of shame and a desperate flickering hope. "I'm used to the cold," she whispered, her voice so thin the wind nearly stole it. He could have said something practical, something about a warm fire or a dry roof. But words like that felt wrong coming from him, a man known more for the strength in his back than the kindness on his tongue. So instead, he did the only thing that felt honest. He shrugged off his heavy rancher's coat and draped it over her trembling shoulders. She flinched at the sudden weight, the unfamiliar warmth, then clutched it shut. The coat smelled of leather and rain and a kind of steady strength she'd never known. "You didn't have to do that," she murmured, her face buried in the collar. "Stand up for me." "Your sister shouldn't have needed a reminder that cruelty isn't the same as being clever," he replied. His voice wasn't angry. It was just tired, the kind of tired that comes from surviving too many winters alone. She looked up then, searching his face in the gloom, looking for the mockery she expected to find there. But there was none. There was only a deep, quiet sorrow. She looked down at her muddy shoes. "They'll talk worse now," she said, "because of this." He didn't hesitate. "They already do." The rain softened just then, turning from a downpour to a fine mist. From somewhere across the valley, a church bell struck the hour, its lonely sound folding through the hills like a tired heartbeat. Samuel put his hat back on, a gesture of finality, and started toward his horse, which was tethered patiently by a post. "You live out near the ridge?" he asked over his shoulder. "Past it," she answered. "It's too far to walk in this." He untied the reins, the leather groaning in the damp air. He gestured with his head toward the saddle. "Then ride," she hesitated. Proper girls didn't ride behind ranchers in the middle of the night. Proper girls didn't accept coats from strange men. But then she heard it, a faint echo of her sister's laughter carried on the wind from the barn, and the sting of that shame was sharper than any fear of gossip. She took his offered hand. It was rough and calloused, but steady. He pulled her up behind him, and the motion didn't feel like a rescue. It felt like balance, something she hadn't realized she'd lost until that very moment. They rode in silence, the only sounds the squelch of hooves in the mud and the drumming of the storm. The wind whipped drops of rain from the brim of his hat into her hair. The golden glow of the barn faded behind them, swallowed by the night until there was only the darkness and the thunder. And in the rhythm of the storm she heard something else, something strange and new. His breathing. It was slow and steady, like a man who was used to carrying much more than just his own weight. They reached the ridge just as the rain began to thin into silver threads, the moon breaking through the clouds. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper against his back. He was quiet for a long moment before he answered, his voice low but not unkind. "Don't thank me for what ain't real." She stared at the back of his neck, at a faint scar that caught the moonlight, and wondered what kind of truth he was trying so hard to hide. Neither of them knew that their shared ride was a spark, and by morning the whole town's gossip would fan it into a wildfire, swearing they'd seen a married couple ride out of the storm, leaving the world behind. By dawn, the storm had wept itself into a fine, clinging mist. The valley was washed clean, but it was trembling with unspoken questions. Evelyn stood by the corral fence at Samuel's ranch, his coat still a heavy protective weight on her shoulders. Steam curled from the horse's flanks in the cool morning air as the first light slid over the horizon. Neither of them had slept. They'd reached his small, quiet ranch just as the thunder had grumbled its last goodbyes. He'd offered her a bedroll by the fire, but she'd refused, choosing the hard bench on the porch instead, her hands folded tight over the borrowed warmth of his coat. He brewed coffee without a word, the familiar ritual a small anchor in the uncertain morning. He poured a tin cup for her and leaned against a porch post, his eyes fixed on the distant hills where the fog clung like a stubborn memory. "They'll be talking by now," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Margaret's tongue rides faster than any horse." Evelyn's fingers tightened around the warm tin cup. "Then let them talk," she whispered, but even she could hear the tremor in her voice. "They'll call me names I can't ever wash off." He turned then, his brow furrowed, the lines on his face deeper in the pale light. "You think I care for gossip?" "No," she said, her gaze dropping to the mud-streaked hem of her ruined dress. "But I do." For a long moment, the only sound was the wind moving through the tall grass, a soft, sighing sound, like something making up its mind. Then she lifted her head. Her eyes were wide, desperate, but a new, steely resolve burned in them. "Pretend to be my husband, Samuel." The words shocked her as much as they did him. They hung in the cold air between them, suspended between the steam from their coffee and the weight of their disbelief. Samuel blinked once, slowly. His jaw shifted. "You're talking foolishness." "Am I?" she shot back, her voice gaining strength. "They saw you defend me. They saw us ride out of here together. They're going to believe it anyway. If you don't say it's true, they'll leave me to carry the shame of it alone. Your kindness will be my ruin." He just stared at her. This thin, trembling woman who had faced down a barn full of laughter without shedding a tear. He tried to summon the scorn, the dismissal the situation called for, but he couldn't find it. He set his cup down on the railing with a soft click and stepped closer to her. "A lie don't wash any cleaner than the truth, Evelyn," he said, his voice gentle. "But sometimes," she replied, her voice barely more than a breath, "it keeps a person warm until morning." The sentence hung there, so fragile and yet so full of fight that he almost smiled. It was the kind of courage he understood. The porch clock ticked, a single stubborn sound in the vast quiet of the morning. He gave one sharp nod. "All right, just till morning?" She shook her head, her gaze unwavering. "No, till they forget." He let out a long sigh, a cloud of white in the cold air. "They never forget." But he lifted her hand anyway, resting it for a half-second against the solid warmth of his chest before letting it go. It wasn't a promise, it was an agreement, a conspiracy. And inside the house, the young ranch hand, Tom, who had been peeking through the window, saw the whole exchange. His eyes were wide. He had seen enough to carry a story, a brand new story, to town before the breakfast bells even started ringing. Evelyn followed Samuel to the hitching post, her skirt brushing against the wet grass, her face half lit by the rising sun. A new day, a new life, built on a lie. "What do we tell them?" she asked, her voice hushed. "Nothing," he said, tightening the saddle cinch with a firm tug. "We'll let our silence do the talking. When they rode toward town, they didn't ride as a rancher and a grateful girl. They rode as a unit. The dew on the fields sparkled like shattered glass, and startled birds rose from the fence line as they passed. The main street of Cold Water was already awake. Men were sweeping their porches, women were hanging laundry, and one by one conversations stuttered and died as the pair came into view. Her wrapped in his big coat, him sitting straight-backed and unreadable in the saddle. Someone dropped a broom. It clattered on the boardwalk, the sound unnaturally loud. Another woman whispered to her neighbor, "He's finally wed." Evelyn's stomach felt like it was full of angry butterflies, but Samuel didn't even flinch. He swung down from the horse, his boots hitting the dirt with a solid thud. Then he turned and offered her his arm. She took it. Her hand was trembling, but she took it. Together they walked through the town square, straight toward the churchyard, where the gossip was always the loudest. Margaret was there, standing among the other wives, her eyes as wide and dark as thunderclouds. For the first time in her life, Evelyn met her sister's gaze and didn't look away. Samuel tipped his hat to the preacher, whose mouth was hanging open like a broken gate. "Morning, preacher," he said, his voice calm and even. "Seems I went and got myself a wife after all." The crowd erupted in a low murmur, a wave of shock and disbelief. Margaret's face drained of all color, becoming as pale as the linen she wore. Evelyn's knees felt like they were about to buckle, but Samuel's hand was a firm, steady pressure at her back, guiding her forward as if it had always belonged there. And though she knew, with every fiber of her being, that this was all a lie, a desperate pretense, she also knew that for the first time in her life, humiliation had been replaced by a strange, fierce pride. Somewhere behind them, the church bells began to ring for the Sunday service, louder and faster than usual, as if the valley itself had decided to believe the lie they'd just spoken into existence. By noon, Cold Water Town was buzzing like a hornet's nest that had been kicked. The church bells had stopped ringing hours ago, but their echo seemed to be trapped in every mouth, on every tongue. "Married," whispered Mrs. Carden over a sack of flour at the dry goods store. "The quiet one, with him." The blacksmith, a man of few words, swore to anyone who would listen that he'd seen them ride in at dawn, her wrapped in that big coat of his hand steady on the reins, looking for all the world like he was protecting what was his. Within hours, the gossip had crossed every porch, been stirred into every teacup, and climbed the winding stairs all the way to the ward's front parlor, where Margaret sat stiff-backed and furious beside her mother. "It's a lie," she hissed, her hands clenched in her lap. "He would never pick her. Not over me." But even as her mother tried to soothe her, the older woman's lips trembled. "The town saw what it saw," she whispered. Outside on those same streets, Evelyn walked. the very streets that had echoed with laughter at her expense just the night before. But today she walked with her chin held high, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Samuel was one step behind her, a silent, formidable shadow. People stopped sweeping. They stopped hanging their laundry. They stopped breathing. They just watched. "Mornin'," Samuel said to one man, his voice as calm and steady as wood smoke. The man didn't answer, but he didn't laugh either. No one dared to laugh. When they passed the blacksmith's shop, the big man muttered something under his breath about real courage, and that one small kindness was enough to steady Evelyn's trembling hands. At the end of the street, the preacher hurried to catch up with them, his face pale with an excitement he was trying to disguise as clerical duty. "Mr. Redden," he called out, slightly out of breath. "If this is true, the church must be informed. A proper—" Samuel cut him off, his voice polite but firm. "If it's true, preacher, it'll stand on its own." The preacher blinked, flustered, adjusting his collar. He wasn't used to being dismissed by anyone but God himself. Evelyn wanted to shrink, to disappear into the dust of the street, but Samuel's silence wrapped around her like a suit of armor. They reached the hitching post outside the general store, and she paused, trying to gather her breath. A small child pointed a grubby finger at her hand. "She ain't got a ring," he said loudly. His mother snatched him back, her face flushing with embarrassment. "I can't do this, Samuel," Evelyn whispered, her voice cracking. "You're already doing it," he said simply. He helped her onto the wagon bench he'd brought into town, his touch so gentle and natural that the onlookers didn't know whether to stare harder or look away in confusion. The ride back to his ranch shimmered with unspoken tension. The heat rose from the road, and the weight of the town's eyes felt like it was physically pressing down on them. Halfway up the ridge, she finally broke the quiet. "They'll turn on you too, you know." He didn't even look at her. "Let 'em," he replied. "I've worked this land alone long enough not to miss the company." "But your trade, your name—" "My name ain't never been worth much till now," he said. His words fell between them, heavy and solid. They weren't defensive. They were just honest. And for the first time, she heard something in his voice that wasn't pity or duty. It was choice. Behind them, the town bell tolled again, a false heartbeat marking the birth of their lie. By the time they reached the gate to his ranch, they saw a rider approaching fast from the valley, dust trailing behind like a plume of angry smoke. It was Margaret. Her bonnet was askew, her eyes blazing with a fire that had nothing to do with righteousness. She reined her horse in so hard it danced sideways. She didn't dismount. "How dare you!" she shouted, her voice cracking with fury. "He's mine!" Samuel stepped forward, placing himself between the two sisters. "He's your what, Margaret?" The question, so simple and quiet, broke her composure. "My," she faltered, unable to finish the sentence, because the truth of what she wanted, and why she wanted it, was too ugly to be spoken aloud. Evelyn stepped up to stand beside Samuel, her shoulders straight, a hint of color returning to her cheeks. "Your joke?" she asked softly. "Was he just your joke?" Margaret froze, the words lodged in her throat. All she could do was glare, her hatred a palpable thing. "This isn't over," she finally spat, yanking her horse's head around and galloping back the way she came. "It never is," Samuel muttered, watching her disappear into the trees. Silence fell again, but it was different this time. It wasn't empty. The air between them pulsed with something raw and new. It was half fear, half a terrifying beginning. From the porch, young Tom peeked out, his eyes wide. "Should I tell folks you're home, Mr. Redden?" Samuel looked at Evelyn, at the woman who now carried his name, his silence and his scandal in equal measure. He mounted the porch steps, his boots heavy on the wood. "Tell 'em the truth, Tom," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet air. Mr. and Mrs. Redden are taking their supper early tonight. Tom's eyes widened in understanding. And by nightfall, that one simple sentence would set the entire valley on fire. Evening settled over the ranch, slow and amber, the kind of light that stretches shadows until they touch old secrets. The air smelled of dust and pine, and a low rumble of thunder sounded far beyond the ridge, a promise of another storm to come. Samuel had saddled 2 horses before Evelyn could even offer to help. She stood at the corral rail watching him work. He moved with a quiet efficiency, his hands knowing exactly what to do. He checked the reins twice, tied a second bedroll behind his saddle, then looked up at her as if he'd just remembered she was there. "Town will be talking worse by tomorrow," he said, his voice flat. "It's best you stay out here for a while." She nodded, though a fresh wave of fear rippled through her. "I can't stay in your house," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "Not alone. Not with you." He didn't meet her eyes. He just kept working. "Ain't asking you to." He tossed a heavy tarp over his saddle. "There's an old cabin west of the creek. Belonged to the Handley family before the fever took 'em. You'll have 4 walls and some quiet there." She looked towards the hills, where the sky was bruising into a deep, stormy purple. "It'll rain before we get there." "Then we'll ride faster," he said. The tone was rough, but the intention wasn't. When he helped her mount her horse, his calloused hand brushed against her wrist. The touch was brief, but it steadied more than just her body. The horses started at a brisk trot, their hooves striking a steady rhythm on the hard-packed earth as the wind began to shift, growing colder. They hadn't gone half a mile before the rain found them. It started as thin, sharp needles, then quickly grew heavy and relentless. But they didn't stop. The world narrowed to the motion of the horses, the sound of their own breathing, and the sting of the rain. Evelyn's hair was plastered to her neck, her borrowed dress soaked and heavy. She started to shiver, a deep, uncontrollable trembling. Samuel slowed his horse to ride beside her. Without a word, he shrugged out of his coat, the same one she had worn that morning, and threw it behind her on the horse, never breaking his pace. "I told you." She started to protest, clutching the familiar warmth around herself. "Told you you'd catch cold," he finished for her. Just then a jagged fork of lightning cut across the sky, a brilliant, terrifying blue-white. For a split second it illuminated his face, and in that flash he looked fierce, determined, and strangely young. For a long time neither of them spoke. The landscape blurred into a wash of green and gray. The trail turned to slick, treacherous mud, and the creek ahead, normally a gentle stream, was now a roaring, angry torrent of brown water. "We'll have to cross," he shouted over the noise. "Hold on tight." She obeyed without question, wrapping her arms around his waist as he urged his horse forward, pulling hers along with him. They plunged into the current. The water was shockingly cold, a physical blow that stole her breath. She gasped, pressing her face against the solid wall of his back. He shouted something, but the roar of the water swallowed the words. A heartbeat later, a terrifying, endless heartbeat, their horses found purchase on the far bank. They were through, soaked, shivering, but alive. On the other side, the cabin rose out of the mist like a ghost. Its roof sagged, and the smoke hole was a dark eye open to the stormy sky. He dismounted first, his boots squelching in the mud. He helped her down, then led the horses under the slight protection of the eaves. "Get inside," he said, his voice rough with urgency. She hesitated, her teeth chattering so hard she could barely stand. "You'll freeze out here," she managed to say. "I've frozen before," was his only reply. Still, after he tied the reins, he followed her in. The cabin was dark, but it was mostly dry. He fumbled in his pockets and found a box of old matches. He struck one. The tiny flame sputtered, then caught. He lit a stub of a candle he found on a dusty shelf, and the small room was filled with a warm, amber light. She crouched by the cold hearth, trying to wring the water from her skirt. He knelt beside her, his movements economical and sure. He dropped a handful of dry twigs into the grate, added some larger kindling, and coaxed a flame to life. The fire grew, crackling and spitting, painting her pale face with warmth and flickering shadows. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice soft, almost lost in the sound of the fire and the storm. He didn't answer right away. He stared into the flames, and the shadows on his face seemed to move slower than his thoughts. "Because," he said finally, his voice a low, gravelly sound, "I've seen too many good people freeze to death for the sake of someone else's pride." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and for the first time she didn't see a rescuer or a silent stranger. She saw a man who had already lost so much that he couldn't bear to walk away from the little that still lived. Outside, the thunder cracked again, a deafening explosion directly overhead. The horses shifted restlessly, their hooves thumping against the earth. "We'll ride back in the morning," he said. "Let the town talk to itself tonight." She nodded, her eyes fixed on the fire. In his coat pocket, her ribbon was a hidden secret, a silent bridge between them that neither one of them yet dared to cross. And for the first time since her sister had made her a public joke, Evelyn felt the burn of something she hadn't realized she was missing. It felt like safety, and it looked for all the world like danger. By sunrise, the story had outpaced the truth. Before Samuel or Evelyn even thought of returning to town, half of Cold Water had already made up its mind about what kind of woman she was, and what kind of man he must be to keep her. The storekeeper's wife swore on a stack of Bibles that she'd seen a light burning in Samuel's main house all night long. The preacher's son, a boy with more imagination than sense, claimed he'd been hunting and had seen them through the window of the old Handley cabin, sharing a coat by the fire. Gossip, fueled by outrage and envy, galloped faster than any horse, and Margaret Ward was in the saddle, whipping it into a frenzy. She arrived on the sheriff's porch before he'd even had his breakfast, her voice trembling with expertly feigned concern. "My sister has been taken, Sheriff," she cried, dabbing at her dry eyes with a lace handkerchief. "Or worse, she's been ruined by that man." By noon, Sheriff Harland, a man who preferred peace and quiet over just about anything, was reluctantly saddling his horse, two grim-faced church deacons beside him. The town began to gather in the square, a congregation sensing that blood was about to be spilled one way or another. The sky hung heavy and gray, mirroring the mood of the crowd, when Samuel and Evelyn finally rode back down the main street. She was pale, but her back was straight, her chin held high despite the mud stains on her dress and the sleepless exhaustion in her eyes. Samuel's jaw was set like a block of granite. He hadn't spoken more than 3 words to her since they'd broken camp that morning. The silence between them was no longer a fragile thing. It had hardened into something solid enough to carry them both. When the sheriff raised a hand, Samuel reined his horse to a halt. "We've had some complaints, Redden," Harlan said, his voice echoing in the tense quiet. "That so?" Samuel asked, his tone dangerously mild. "A decent woman can't just disappear overnight without a word," the sheriff continued, his eyes shifting uncomfortably toward Evelyn. "Especially not with a man like you." Just then, Margaret stepped out from the crowd, her face perfectly powdered, her smile as brittle as a dried leaf. "Tell them, Evie," she said, her voice dripping with venomous pity. "Tell them all how he forced you." Evelyn's heart gave one hard, painful thud against her ribs. Every eye in Cold Water was fixed on her, waiting. The preacher's wife whispered loudly, "Lord, have mercy on that poor child." But before Evelyn could find her voice, before she could even think, Samuel swung down from his horse. He walked straight up to the sheriff, took off his hat, and held it in his hands. "No one forced anything," he said, his voice even and clear. "We're wed." The air didn't just crack, It shattered. Soft gasps, muffled curses, and waves of pure, unadulterated shock rippled through the square. Margaret's carefully constructed smile completely fell apart. "That's a lie," she shrieked, her voice shrill. "You would never choose her." Samuel turned to face her, his calm gaze colder than a winter rain. "I didn't choose her," he said. The crowd stilled, hanging on the pause. "She chose me," he finished, his eyes finding Evelyn's. "And I said yes." The words landed like nails being driven into the lid of a coffin. Margaret's pride was buried deep beneath them. The preacher cleared his throat, his face flushed and flustered. If this union is true," he stammered, "we'll need some manner of proof." Samuel didn't miss a beat. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the small, folded blue ribbon. It was smooth and uncreased, despite the storm. He walked over to Evelyn and placed it in her trembling hand. "You dropped this," he said, his voice quiet enough for only her to hear. "The night we met." Then he raised his voice for the town to hear. "Seems it's found its proper place now." Her eyes widened. She understood the message he was sending, not just to her, but to everyone. The town saw only a symbol, a token, a ribbon instead of a ring. Murmurs broke out. The sheriff rubbed his jaw, looking from Samuel to Evelyn and back again. "Well," he muttered, clearly wanting this to be over. "Then I reckon it stands." Margaret, however, wasn't finished. She lunged forward, her face contorted with rage. "You think this farce makes you respectable?" she snarled at her sister. "No," Evelyn said, her voice soft but steady. "It makes me seen." For the first time in her life, she didn't flinch. She didn't look away. Margaret's hand flew up, ready to strike her, but Samuel's hand shot out and caught her wrist in midair. His grip was firm, but there was no anger in it, only a deep, weary finality. "You've done enough harm, Margaret," he said. "Go home." She jerked her hand free, hot tears of fury finally slicing through her powdered cheeks. She turned and stormed away, the crowd parting before her in an uneasy, shuffling silence. Evelyn stood rooted to the spot, her breath coming in uneven gasps, the little blue ribbon pressed against her heart. The preacher murmured something about blessings and paperwork, and the crowd slowly began to disperse, muttering amongst themselves. Samuel placed a steadying hand on her back. "You did fine," he said quietly. "You made it the truth." "But it isn't," she whispered, the lie a bitter taste in her mouth. "Ain't it?" he asked, meeting her eyes. And for one long, suspended heartbeat, neither of them could tell where the lie ended and where a desperate kind of mercy began. The rain started up again. Not a violent storm this time, but slow, steady drops that blurred the dust in the street, washing all the footprints into one long, shared trail that led them, for better or for worse, home. The rain followed them all the way back to the ridge, a soft and steady presence, as if it had no intention of leaving them alone with their newly forged lie. By the time they reached the gate of Samuel's ranch, the horses were slick with water, and Evelyn's hands were trembling, not just from the cold, but from the aftershock of the day. He lifted her down from the saddle without a word. His touch was careful, almost hesitant, as though he feared one wrong move might shatter the fragile reality they had built in the town square. The land around them was quiet, the grass heavy with rain, the sky a uniform pewter gray. The only sound was the creak of the barn door swinging in the wind. He guided the horses inside, loosened their saddles, and began to rub them dry with old sacks, while she stood on the porch, staring out at the valley below. From this height, the town of Coldwater looked small and insignificant, its rumors smaller still. But she could still feel the echo of their judgment clinging to her skin. When he came back out, he found her still standing there, his coat wrapped around her like a piece of borrowed courage. "You can go back tomorrow if you want," he said, his voice even, betraying nothing. They'll be tired of talking by then." "You really think so?" she asked, a bitter smile touching her lips. He gave a half shrug that wasn't quite a smile. "No, but you'll learn how to walk through it." She turned to face him, her damp hair framing her pale face. "You speak like a man who already has." "I stopped caring what people said," he replied quietly, "when the one person worth listening to quit speaking." And she knew, without having to ask, that he was talking about his late wife. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The rain softened to a hush, a gentle sigh against the roof. The porch door creaked open behind them. It was Tom, the young ranch hand, peeking out. He was holding 2 chipped mugs, steam rising from them. "Coffee's hot, sir," he said, his eyes darting curiously to Evelyn. "Miss, Mrs. Redden." The name struck her like a physical blow, a chord of music too beautiful to possibly be meant for her. Samuel shot the boy a look that warned him not to linger, but he didn't correct him. He just took the mugs and handed one to her. Evelyn took it, her fingers brushing against his for a fraction of a second. A jolt of warmth spread through her, faster and more potent than the hot coffee. They sat in silence on the porch steps, watching the fog drift in lazy currents across the meadow. "Do you regret it?" she asked softly, finally breaking the quiet. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "The lie." "The kindness," she clarified. "Kindness ain't something a man can afford to regret," he said, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Sometimes it's the only thing he's got to take with him when he goes." The simple, stark honesty of it cut through her defenses, but the chasm between them remained. The lie they had told was a real, humming, dangerous thing. He rose, finishing his coffee in one long swallow, and looked towards the barn. "I'll sleep out there. You can take the main house." "I can manage with a blanket by the fire," she offered quickly. "Not under my roof," he said, and there was a note of finality in his tone that allowed for no argument. A man's got to keep at least one thing honest, even when he's living a lie. She opened her mouth to protest, to argue, but stopped. The logic was both cruel and pure, and she couldn't fight it. He nodded toward the lamp burning in the window. "Keep that lit. The storm will pass by dawn." He stepped off the porch and into the rain, his broad shoulders squared against the weather. He crossed the muddy yard to the barn, his figure quickly swallowed by the mist. Alone, Evelyn watched the faint glow from the barn window flicker like a lonely heartbeat through the fog. She didn't go into the house. She sat on the floor of the porch, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the little blue ribbon which she had laid carefully on the table. Its color seemed duller in the gray light, but it still felt warm in her hand, as if it remembered the heat of the fire or the safety of his pocket. She thought of his words, of how easily he had turned a scandal into a shelter for her, and then how quickly that shelter had turned back into solitude. The wind shifted, and a faint roll of thunder echoed from beyond the hills. She whispered into the empty, misty air, "He says it's a lie, but the world already believes it's true." She looked towards the flickering light in the barn again, and she wondered. She wondered if the man inside still believed his own silence, or if somewhere, deep beneath the solitude and the sorrow, he had already started to believe in her. Night folded itself around the ranch like a worn, heavy blanket. The rain had finally stopped, leaving behind the clean, sharp smell of wet cedar and the soft hiss of the fire that Evelyn had built in the hearth. She sat on the floor beside it, her hair unpinned and falling around her shoulders, her sleeves rolled to her elbows. Her eyes were half lost in the slow, hypnotic dance of the flames. She'd tried reading an old farm ledger she'd found on a shelf, anything to keep her mind from replaying the events of the last 2 days. But the neat columns of numbers blurred into the memory of laughter. Her sister's cruel laughter, the town's hungry laughter, and even the ghost of her own, from a time long ago when she still believed that being quiet would keep her safe. The main door creaked open. Samuel stepped in from the barn, his shirt clinging damply to his shoulders. He held a lantern in one hand and a deep, bone-weary exhaustion in the other. "Storm's done," he said simply, hanging his wet hat on a peg by the door. "But the creek's risen. We're cut off from town till at least morning." Evelyn nodded, her gaze still on the fire. "Maybe that's a mercy," she said softly. He looked at her, a faint, tired smile touching his lips. "You've got an odd way of seeing mercy." "It gives us one night," she answered, looking up at him, "where nobody can reach us." He walked over to the fire and set the lantern down on the hearth. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't the hard, angry kind they had shared before. This was a different silence. This was the kind that waited, patiently, for permission to be broken. Finally, she was the one who broke it. "You never really wanted Margaret, did you?" His head tilted slightly, but he didn't seem surprised by the question. "Wanting ain't the same thing as choosing," he said, his voice a low rumble. "She was what people said I should have. A good name, a proper match, a smile that knew how to behave in church. And me?" The question hung in the air between them, fragile and half-daring. He picked up the iron poker and nudged a log in the fire before he answered. "You," he said, "were the one I wasn't supposed to notice." Her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't the romance of the words that struck her, but the simple, painful recognition. "She used to take your letters," she confessed, the secret she'd kept for years suddenly spilling out. "The ones you sent her after your mother passed, the one about the church fair. She read them, laughed, and then she threw them in the stove. She said you'd have forgotten her by the time the ink was dry anyway." His hand, which had been resting on the poker, stilled completely. "She did what?" "I kept one," Evelyn whispered. She reached into the small bundle of her belongings she'd brought from her old home and pulled out a single folded sheet of paper. Its edges were browned and brittle with age. "You wrote, 'There's still kindness left in this valley, if only I could find where it hides.' I kept it," her voice trembled, "because I needed to believe that kindness like that really existed somewhere." Samuel looked at the piece of paper as if it were a mirror he had never intended to look into again. "And now?" he asked, his voice rough. "Now I know where it was hiding," she said quietly. The fire crackled, sending a shower of bright orange sparks up the chimney. For a long moment, he didn't move, didn't speak. Then he reached into his own coat, which was hanging by the fire to dry. He drew out the pale blue ribbon and laid it on the mantelpiece between them. "I've carried this since that night," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name, couldn't make sense of why. "Because you knew it was mine." "No," he said softly, finally looking at her. "Because I knew it didn't belong to the woman I thought I was supposed to want." Her eyes glistened in the firelight, reflecting the dancing flames. "And what about the woman the town says you've taken?" He hesitated, then shook his head, a slow, sad movement. "She deserves better than a rumor." He paused. "And you? You deserve better than a man who hides behind his silence." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of everything they still couldn't say, of years of loneliness and misunderstanding. The little blue ribbon glowed faintly on the mantel, catching the firelight, a fragile bridge between his past and their uncertain future. "You should get some sleep," he said at last, standing up. "Tomorrow the creek will drop and we'll have to face what we've built." She looked up at him, her voice trembling. "You mean the lie?" He paused at the door to the small hallway and glanced back at her just once. "No," he said, "the truth that came after it." Then he was gone, leaving her with the sound of the crackling fire, the weight of his old letter, and the sight of a ribbon that no longer felt borrowed. The creek had dropped by morning, but not enough to wash away the trouble that was waiting for them in town. By noon, a rider came pounding up the ridge, splashing through the mud. It was Tom's cousin from the livery stable, and he was shouting before he even got to the porch. "Preacher's called a hearing. Noon bell tomorrow, he says, for the whole town to witness." Samuel listened, his face a mask of stone, while Evelyn stood behind him in the doorway, the blue ribbon now tied securely around her wrist. It felt less like a decoration and more like a piece of armor she hadn't yet earned the right to wear. "A hearing?" she whispered. "For what?" "For us," he said, his voice grim. "This town doesn't know how to forgive what it secretly envies." That night, neither of them slept. The fire in the hearth burned low, throwing long, restless shadows across the walls that looked like ghosts. To keep his hands from shaking, Samuel sat at the table and sharpened an old hunting knife, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone filling the quiet house. Evelyn sat by the window, mending one of Tom's torn shirts, her needle moving in and out of the fabric, but her eyes never left the dark line of the ridge. When dawn finally came, pale and bitter cold, they rode down toward town, side by side. This time, every single hoofbeat on the hard-packed road sounded like a question that neither of them knew how to answer. Coldwater's little white church stood waiting for them, its steeple stabbing at the gray, unforgiving sky. The square below was teeming with faces, farmers, their wives, their children, all pressed together as if their collective righteousness required witnesses. Margaret stood near the front steps, her bonnet spotless, her expression a careful carving of pride and fear. Sheriff Harland was trying to keep some semblance of order, but the crowd was buzzing like a disturbed hive. The preacher, standing on the top step, lifted his heavy Bible and called out in a booming voice, "Samuel Redden, Evelyn Ward, come forward." Samuel dismounted first, then turned and helped Evelyn down. Her knees trembled for a second, then held steady. Together they walked through the silent, watching crowd and stepped onto the church porch. "You stand accused," the preacher intoned, his voice full of solemn importance, "of deceiving this congregation, of mocking the holy vows of matrimony, and of causing a grave scandal among God-fearing folk." Samuel's reply was as steady as a hammer striking an anvil. "We stand accused of feeding gossip what it was already hungry to eat." A few murmurs rippled through the crowd. A man in the back even cracked a smile, despite himself. Margaret's voice rose, sharp and brittle as broken glass. "He's a liar. She trapped him. She's always been jealous." Evelyn turned to face her sister, and her voice, when it came, was clear and strong, even though her hands were shaking so badly she had to clench them into fists. "Trapped him? No. I begged him to pretend. I begged him, and he said yes. I thought a lie would save me from your cruelty, Margaret. But instead," her voice rose, "it saved me from a lifetime of thinking I was worthless." The crowd fell silent. Even the wind seemed to pause its restless journey through the valley. The preacher frowned, looking down at his book. "So you admit to the deceit?" "I admit to being desperate," she said. "But if mercy is worth anything in this valley, then let it count for something here, today." Samuel stepped forward, and in front of God and everyone, he took her hand in his. "She asked me to pretend," he said, his voice resonating across the square. "And I did. At first, it was to spare her from shame. And then—" He paused, his eyes sweeping over the faces in the crowd, meeting every gaze. "Then it was because I've seen what shame does to good people, and I've seen it happen too many times before. You all talk about holiness. Maybe holiness is just honesty when it's under fire." For a moment, nobody breathed. Margaret opened her mouth to speak again, but her own mother reached out, and her hand on Margaret's wrist stilled her. The preacher closed his Bible slowly. "There are sins of the flesh," he said, his voice quieter now, more thoughtful. "And there are sins of the tongue. I reckon the Lord knows which one runs deeper. He turned to the crowd. You wanted the truth. You've heard it. Now go home. The murmuring started again, breaking like distant thunder. It was a sound of half relief, half confusion. Some people nodded. Others just turned and walked away, muttering under their breath. Margaret stood frozen, her lips white with fury and defeat. Evelyn let out a shaky breath, the weight of 100 pairs of eyes finally lifting from her shoulders. Samuel squeezed her hand once, a firm, reassuring pressure. The trial's done, he said quietly. Not yet, she whispered back, glancing down at the blue ribbon tied around her wrist. There's one more truth left to speak. He followed her gaze and understood. He saw the faint outline of something folded, hidden within the knot of the ribbon. The proof she had been saving for this exact moment. The storm that had started with cruel laughter in a crowded barn was about to end with a revelation that would shake the town to its very foundation. The next morning rose clear and cruelly bright, the kind of sharp autumn sky that left no place for shadows or lies to hide. Coldwater's church bell began tolling long before the appointed hour, its solemn clang calling the town not to worship, but to judgment. Evelyn stood at the edge of the square, Samuel right beside her. The pale blue ribbon was looped around her wrist, its ends fluttering in the breeze like two halves of a heart that refused to quite meet. The crowd was even larger than the day before. Farmers stood with mud still caked on their boots, women clutched their Bibles like shields, and children tugged at their mothers' skirts, their eyes wide, trying to see the spectacle of sin and salvation. Margaret waited near the preacher's steps, her face powdered an unnatural white, her eyes as sharp and dangerous as shards of glass. "Ready?" Samuel asked, his voice a low murmur only she could hear. "No," Evelyn whispered back, "but I'm done with running." Together they started walking toward the front, the crowd parting before them with the soft rustle of fabric and the sound of 100 people holding their breath. The preacher lifted his Bible again, ready to begin, but Evelyn spoke first. "Yesterday," she said, her voice rising steady and clear over the silent square, "I begged this town for mercy. Today I've come to bring the truth." She raised her wrist, the one with the ribbon, and with slow, deliberate movements, she began to unwrap it. The crowd leaned forward as one, a collective body straining to see. As the fabric uncoiled, it revealed what it had been hiding all along. A small, folded packet of paper, worn and creased at the edges, bound tightly for years. "These are letters," she said, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "Letters written by the man you all mock as silent and proud. Letters he sent to my sister years ago when he thought she was a kind woman. She never answered him. She told me she burned them, one by one, to keep him waiting, to feed her own vanity." A sharp gasp rippled through the crowd, as quick and cold as wind through glass. "But one," Evelyn continued, her voice rising even higher, "one she never got the chance to destroy, because I saved it from the fire." She looked straight at Samuel, her eyes glistening. "In it, he wrote not to her, but about this town, about all of you. He said he wished he could live among people who still believed that kindness wasn't the same thing as weakness. I carried that letter through years of being mocked and ignored, because I needed to believe that a man like that, a heart like that, truly existed somewhere in this world." She turned back to Samuel, her gaze softening. "Now I know he does." She handed the fragile, browned letter to the preacher, who took it from her as if it were a holy relic. The old man unfolded it, his hands trembling slightly. His lips moved as he read the words aloud, his voice slow and shaking with emotion. "If decency is truly forgotten in this valley, may the Lord send me just one honest soul to remind me what grace looks like." The church square fell into a profound silence. Even the horses hitched to the posts outside seemed to stop stamping their feet. Samuel stood utterly still, his eyes fixed on the dirt at his feet, his face a mask of stunned disbelief. It was Margaret's voice that broke the silence, brittle and desperate. "She forged it. She's lying. She's always been a liar." But the preacher just shook his head slowly. He turned the paper toward Samuel. "This is your handwriting, son," he said gently. Then he looked at Margaret. "And this ink," he said, his gaze sharp, "ain't new." Margaret's face drained of all color, becoming as white as milk. She staggered back a step, her carefully constructed world of pride and deceit unraveling faster than the crowd's shock could comprehend. Samuel finally spoke, his voice low, carved from equal parts shame and relief. "I wrote that a long time ago," he murmured. "I thought it never mattered." Evelyn turned back to the people, her voice soft but clear enough for every person to hear. "It mattered to me. It saved me." And for the first time since she had known him, Samuel Redden met her gaze fully, his silence no longer a shield, but a confession. The preacher gently folded the letter and held it to his chest. "Then let the record show," he declared, his voice booming with newfound conviction, "that there was no mockery of vows here. There was only mercy, long delayed." The crowd exhaled in one great, collective breath. Whispers turned from scorn to awe. Some people even smiled, their faces filled with a quiet shame for their own hunger for cruelty. Margaret, with a choked sob, turned and fled the square, her frantic footsteps swallowed by the same dust she had so eagerly stirred up. Evelyn's knees finally gave way, but Samuel was there, catching her arm before she could fall. He was steady, as always. "You kept my words safe," he murmured, his voice thick. "And you gave them back to me," she whispered, her own voice finally breaking, "right when I needed to hear them the most." The preacher raised his hand for silence one last time. "Let this day stand as proof," he announced, "that even a lie can become a truth, if it is spoken not for pride, but for love." The bell tolled again, softer this time. It wasn't a call to judgment, but a sound of release. And when its echo finally faded, no one spoke at all. Because in that golden morning hush, every heart in the valley knew that the truth, after a long and difficult journey, had finally found its home. When the bell's final echo faded and the murmurs dissolved into the soft shuffle of boots on dirt, Samuel Redden took off his hat. He set it against his chest and turned to face the woman who had just rewritten his life in front of the entire town. The morning sun had found her face, glinting off the loose strands of hair that had escaped her braid, and for the first time he saw her not as the quiet, frightened girl who had begged him to pretend, but as the only person in that entire square who had dared to speak the truth while everyone else hid behind the safety of righteousness. The preacher lowered his Bible. The sheriff cleared his throat. Slowly, as if waking from a long and troubled dream, the townsfolk began to part, creating a narrow path through the middle of the crowd. Samuel didn't move until Evelyn looked up at him, her eyes raw and wet, but steady as the northern star. Then, without a single word, he reached out his hand. She hesitated for only a breath before placing her hand in his. Her fingers were cold and trembling, but they were alive. The square was still except for the faint creak of the church sign swinging in the wind. Together they began to walk. Every step they took sounded louder than the bell that had judged them just an hour before. No one tried to stop them this time. Mrs. Carden, from the dry goods store, bowed her head as they passed. The blacksmith crossed his powerful arms and gave a single, sharp nod of quiet respect. A small child whispered, "Are they leaving?" And his mother hushed him, but even she couldn't take her eyes off the pair, moving through the sunlight and the dust, like two figures from an older, kinder story. Margaret's voice never came again. She was gone, the trail of her pride already growing cold. When they reached the edge of the square, Samuel turned back briefly to face the crowd. "You've had your truth," he said, his voice simple and clear, carrying across the still air. "Now, let us keep ours." Then he guided Evelyn toward the waiting wagon at the hitching post. Young Tom stood there, his eyes wide, holding the reins. He had polished the harness until the leather gleamed, as if he knew, somehow, that this moment would be told and retold for the rest of his life. "Where to, sir?" he asked, his voice full of a new respect. Samuel helped Evelyn up onto the wagon bench before he answered. "Home," he said. The single word was heavy with 1,000 meanings that no one but the two of them could ever untangle. They rode through the town without hurrying, the wagon wheels crackling over the dry earth. And everywhere they passed, shutters opened quietly, windows were peered from, not with curiosity anymore, but with a kind of silent apology. At the church door, the preacher stood watching them go, Samuel's folded letter still pressed against his chest, like a piece of scripture that had finally come true. The sun climbed higher, bleaching the world in a brilliant, forgiving gold. For the first time in weeks, Samuel felt the tightness in his lungs begin to loosen. Beside him, Evelyn kept her gaze fixed forward, the little blue ribbon now untied from her wrist and tied instead around the brim of her hat, where everyone could see it. "Do you think they'll forget?" she asked softly. He smiled, a faint, real smile. "No," he said, "but they'll remember it different now." They reached the top of the ridge as noon flared bright and hot, the valley below them shimmering like a sea of forgiveness. Evelyn let out a long, slow breath, her shoulders easing, her eyes filling with something too light and clear to be tears. "I thought the truth would break us," she said. "Maybe it did," he replied, his gaze on the road ahead. "But what's left after the breaking? That might just be the real part." The wagon creaked up the last incline, and as they crossed over the rise, a gust of wind caught the ribbon on her hat, sending one end fluttering free, a flash of pale blue against the endless sky. Neither of them tried to tie it back down. The road ahead stretched long and empty, the kind of road that could lead anywhere a heart was finally willing to begin again. And as they rode out of sight of the church, the bell rang one last time, not for a trial or a sermon, but like a farewell blessing, whispered over two souls who had finally learned that walking away could sometimes be the truest way of staying put. Weeks passed. The gossip that had once burned through cold water like a prairie fire finally thinned to smoke, then drifted off and vanished over the hills. The town went back to its chores, its harvests, and its prayers. Only the echo of that public hearing lingered, a story told on winter nights, half a warning and half a wonder, about the day truth walked out of the church holding a liar's hand and made the whole world fall quiet for a little while. At Samuel's ranch, the grass grew tall again, waving softly against the fences. The air smelled of hay and sun-warmed wood. A quiet peace had settled over the land. Evelyn woke early each morning, her hair pinned loosely, her sleeves rolled high. She carried water from the well, humming under her breath without even noticing she was doing it. Samuel would often watch her from the porch, a cup of coffee in his hands, his face softer than it had been in years. The hard lines of solitude had been erased by something too gentle and steady to have a name. The ribbon, its color now faded by the sun to the pale blue of a dawn sky, hung from a corner of the corral fence where he had tied it the day they returned. It fluttered whenever the wind passed, a quiet sentinel guarding the space between what they had pretended to be and what they had slowly, quietly become. Some days, folks from town would ride by on their way to the market. They would slow their horses near the gate, tipping their hats or nodding silently. No one spoke of the lie anymore. The story had become something else, something the valley had simply accepted, like the turning of the seasons or the stubborn way the grass always grew back after a fire. Tom still worked in the stables, whistling tunelessly. Sometimes in the evenings he'd tell the younger hands the story of how Mr. and Mrs. Redden had once stood before the preacher and made the whole county swallow its tongue. The boys would laugh, but even their laughter carried a new kind of respect. Inside the little house, life unfolded with the quiet rhythm of breathing. Evelyn's mended clothes hung on pegs next to his. Two coffee mugs always stood waiting by the kettle. The silence between them was no longer about distance. It had learned to feel like peace. One evening, as the sun dropped low and painted the whole world in shades of gold and rose, she found Samuel at the fence line, hammering a loose board back into place. "It's coming loose again," he said, not looking up from his work. She stepped up beside him, her hands resting gently on the warm wood of the fence. "Maybe," she said softly, "it just wants to remind us that not everything that's meant to hold stays tight forever." He glanced up at her then, a small, genuine smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. "Maybe." Her gaze lifted to the faded ribbon fluttering on the post just above them, its threads thin but still unbroken. "Do you ever think about taking it down?" she asked. "No," he said, turning back to his work. "Some things belong right where the wind can find them." The words settled in the quiet air between them. They were easy and final, and right. The evening breeze picked up, carrying the scent of sage and distant wood smoke, brushing against their faces like a blessing. She leaned against the rail, close enough that their shoulders touched, and together they watched the sun sink behind the ridge. The same ridge they had once ridden down in shame, and had left as something stronger, something new. A pair of crows flew across the sky, two black shapes against the crimson light, and the last sound of the day was their lonely cry, fading into the vast, deepening quiet. As dusk settled, the ribbon caught the very last ray of sunlight. It gleamed for just an instant, a flash of memory, before the dark finally took it. It didn't need to shine anymore. Its work was done. The lie had found its way to truth. The wounded had become whole, and the land itself seemed to let out a long, contented sigh. Tomorrow would bring chores and weather and the rhythms of ordinary life, but tonight the frontier rested, wrapped in a deep and abiding calm, holding two souls who had learned that sometimes salvation doesn't come with the clap of thunder. It comes in the soft, persistent rustle of a ribbon on a fence, waving not to be seen, but simply to remember. When she unwrapped that blue ribbon and read his old words aloud, do you think she freed him or herself? If you were Samuel, would you have told the truth sooner, or would you have waited for someone brave enough to bring it out into the light? Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories of the forgotten corners of the past.